Today on the Student Agencies podcast, we're joined by Griffin, Cornell alumni, former CFO of Student Agencies, and following his time at Student Agencies, went on to do IB at Barclays, then went to work at Apollo, and is now a co-founder slash partner at Person Street Partners. Um, in this episode, we'll discuss what it was like managing real P&Ls as a student, the leadership lessons that carried him throughout Wall Street, and how the confidence he built at student agencies gave him the courage to go out on his own. But Griffin, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm honored. I love that you guys are doing this too. I think this is an awesome program.
Yeah, well, we want to get alumni involved. We want to give you guys a platform to talk about your experiences, and we want to help connect the current student body to the opportunities at student agencies because we feel like, folks that are, let's see, you're like 6, 7 years out from graduation at this point.
Yeah, I guess I'm 2018 grad, so yeah, 7 years.
Okay. And I mean, to have founded a company on your own in that period of time after doing sort of Wall Street and private equity is very interesting. Maybe you could tell us about like how you arrived at the decision to start your own venture.
Yeah, I was certainly enabled by student agencies in that regard. It's a lot of the mentors I had or folks that I kind of looked up to from the student agency sphere had entrepreneurial experiences. So, like Michael Carangellin, who was a big mentor of mine. He obviously had a great storied career in Wall Street, and then just started his own fund. David Lesser has kind of been doing his own thing in the real estate world forever. So there were a lot of folks that you know, that I looked up to a lot and were, folks that I emulated who went and did their own thing. And so, in that same respect, after, doing the Wall Street thing and grinding away in investment banking and then sort of a larger private equity shop, it came about somewhat naturally where, I had always had an inclination to go and do something of my own or do something more entrepreneurial. I had the bug at student agencies. That's why a lot of people get into student agencies. And it continued on through my career and at these sort of large institutions. They're, in some ways, sometimes your roles are entrepreneurial, but a lot of times they're not. And there's a lot of hierarchy. So, basically was excited about the thought of going off on my own. And then, was fortunate enough where two of the guys I worked with at Apollo, had similar, inclinations, and we all kind of talked about it in conference rooms and over dinner for months and months. And finally, we all said, "Hey, let's go do this thing together." And then from there, we spent, I don't know, 9 months a year putting together, hey, what's our strategy going to be? What's our kind of central thesis? Where are we going to do this? How are we going to raise money? How are we going to structure things? So, took a lot of time. And then finally, once we got all that kind of ironed out earlier this year, we jumped ship from Apollo back in, I guess, May, moved down to Raleigh. The last of our sort of red tape and non-compete stuff burned off at the end of the summer. We raised a little bit of capital, and now we're off to the races. So, like I said, it is something that, had always had, within me. And then it helped that a lot of the folks that I emulated and admired, had done entrepreneurial ventures. And I figured I'm also at the kind of the right stage in my life to do it. Can always go back to the more traditional corporate paths, but it gets harder and harder the later into life you get, and, more responsibility you have.
Yeah, the golden handcuffs. Uh,
Yeah.
what do you do at Person Street Partners?
Yeah. So Person Street Partners is a regional real estate operator. So, we're investing in industrial and rental housing, kind of broadly speaking, throughout North and South Carolina. And so we see ourselves as sort of a regional sharpshooter. So, in real estate, going off on our own, your thinking is, hey, need to choose a strategy. Is it going to be, asset type specific? So are we going to focus on one sort of niche asset type and be the best in that asset type? Or are we going to go somewhere geographically and be someone who's, boots on the ground, knows every corner and street corner and where you want to be? So we decide the latter. And so that's what we're doing now. So it's acquisitions, it's development. We're spending a lot of time on the industrial side and sort of smaller multi-tenant industrial buildings. And then on the residential side, and we're under contract right now on student homes. So if you think about like the houses on Eddy Street or Catherine or College Ave that students live in, we're under contract on a bunch of those at NC State University. because that's still a very fragmented market where it's a lot of, kind of smaller local owner operators. And so we figure you can go in there and kind of, with our institutional background, hopefully kind of institutionalize that space a little bit. So, it's similar to what I was doing before, where I was in real estate private equity at Apollo. But it's a much more, before I was sort of at the, call it 30,000 foot view, you know, calling the smaller, operators in each market to ask their opinions and do deals alongside them. I kind of we decided to go and be the smaller entity, move down to Raleigh and be that person that, again, the big private equity shops in New York call if they want to invest in Raleigh or Charlotte or anywhere in the Carolinas.
Very cool.
Yeah, that's a really interesting. I don't know, Dan. I don't know if you mentioned this, but we're actually looking into acquiring another property for the student
Really?
agency properties portfolio. Um,
Yeah, well, several things right here on College Avenue have come on the market just in the last couple months, and so we could talk about that in more detail off air. But there are some interesting opportunities around Ithaca at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, it was always I always loved in the relationship between student agencies properties, the foundation, that kind of flywheel, if you will, was always pretty interesting in the way kind of student agencies properties, and those investments in many ways kind of enabled student agencies and to be able to function as it does. So I think that was always a really positive influence on me.
So I'm curious, when you came in as a freshman to Cornell, were you like set on investment banking, finance, those sorts of endeavors? How did you discover that? And then, well, then I have a follow-up question after that.
Yeah. So I transferred into Cornell as a sophomore. So freshman year, I was at the University of Maine. I'm from Maine originally. When I was there, I had sort of an inkling towards finance and financial markets, kind of broadly at the time. I was a freshman. I didn't really know. Took a few classes there. Decided that's what I'd really wanted to do, was going into finance and business in general. And so I started to look to places I could transfer that were sort of a great program for that could lead to a New York City or Boston, and so I was fortunate enough to get into Cornell as a transfer. So when I got there, um, pretty early on in my time at Cornell, I joined a business fraternity, and so from that, I think was really a formative piece of what does being a finance mean, and what are the different options and jobs you can actually have, because finance is such a broad kind of category. And so from there, that's how I got into investment banking, was kind of in a similar way. I talk about entrepreneurship, but it was mentors and older students who, the folks who I thought were really sharp and smart and kind of had their stuff together. You know, they were mostly in investment banking, and so I thought, hey, I want to be like them. Can make good money doing it. Why not give that a shot? So that's how I got into banking, and then I kind of lucked into real estate where and maybe I don't know if I'm jumping the next question or not, but
Go for it.
the real estate thing I lucked into where, I kind of somewhat randomly got placed in the real estate banking group at Barclays. And, I'd been doing the real estate minor, but it wasn't necessarily like this is what I need to do forever. And it was from there that I realized I really liked the real estate aspect more than I liked the finance aspect. And so that's what, pushed me to then kind of leave, and instead of going to a more investment banking type role, leave to a, principal investing role at Apollo in their real estate private equity team. Because there was it was the sticks and bricks. It was the actual buildings that, and the investment in the buildings that interested me versus more of the kind of, financial engineering and corporate finance side of banking.
yeah. Did that answer your second question there?
Oh no, the second question was, how did you then decide to become involved with student agencies, and what role did being the CFO of a real company with, real responsibilities to report to a board, how did that factor into your recruiting process and your interviews?
Yeah. So I got involved. It feels like the way a lot of folks do with student agencies, where, a friend of mine was, Maddie Lieber, and she was the president at student agencies. And then, a guy in my fraternity was the GM of hired hands. And so they both kind of mentioned me, like, hey, the, CFO job, we're hiring for that. You're a finance major, why not apply? And so I applied, interviewed, kind of learned about what student agencies is. thought it was awesome and super interesting. So got involved that way. Um, and then once I was at student agencies, and that was huge for my recruitment for investment banking, just because it really sets you apart a ton versus, it's not a knock on sort of some of the other paths, but oftentimes when you're going for that kind of that internship that's super critical, that, I guess junior to senior year internship, and you're recruiting, your prior internships often have been, sometimes not so glamorous, sometimes somewhat of kind of resume builders that don't have a ton of substance. And so you're kind of, you know, talking out of your butt a little bit in interviews. With student agencies. You had, ran a real, I guess at that time, I think it was like a $2 million revenue P&L, and, actually had to answer to a board that were extremely smart and were extremely accomplished folks, and you're getting grilled with questions by, former investment bankers and private equity individuals and board meetings. And so then when you came time for interviews, it was almost easy because those are, like behavioral, and you're just kind of chit chatting. And if you were, did it right and you studied, you kind of knew the answers to the test, usually a little bit ahead of time. So, um, that piece was huge, you know, it's such a differentiator in interviews. It also, the alumni network, funny enough, was really strong in student agencies. So one of the managing directors at Barclays, who, was kind of like a key decision maker in recruiting, he was at student agencies, whatever it was, a decade or two ago. I think he worked and was the Big Red general manager. And so, he loved to talk about that in our interview. And so, again, I think that's one thing that just sets you apart a little bit. And he's not like a former board member or anything who's super involved, but we had that shared experience as a student agencies. And so he understood that, you know, I had worked in a real environment, cut my teeth doing what is a really, a real job that, takes a lot of time and effort and energy and um, prepares you really well. So I think that for the hiring process, it was incredibly helpful. And then obviously for actually executing on the job, it's a great training mechanism. Student agencies is.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I think that's a common thing we've heard through all of the people we've interviewed is just how different student agencies is compared to, clubs, whatever, you're not working on theoreticals. This is the real business. You're running it at 18, 19 years old. It's really hard to beat. And the stories and the what you can talk about during interviews is just, as you said. So
Yeah, it does in that exactly. And then it helps in the internships, right? Because like again, when you get into the actual internship and you know, someone comes and hands you a piece of work or comments on a, pitch deck for investment banking, if this is your first kind of experience with that, you don't really know what to do. With student agencies, I was like, oh yeah, scribbled handwritten comments on a deck on a wall of numbers, like I've seen this before. Like, make sure to have my highlighter so I know what comments I've actually, reflected already. And so you just have a lot of those already, and you understand how to work in a workplace with, a real boss and real deadlines. And, you learn how to like, you know, you learn to know that the person across from you is usually smarter and has done it longer than you, and so like, fully BSing them often doesn't work. And so if you don't have the answer, you got to know when to kind of just take your licks and say, hey, listen, I don't know. I will research this and come back to you, versus you know, trying to sneak a fast one by somebody who's not only smarter than you, but has been doing it for decades longer. Because that can get you in a lot of hot water.
yeah, yeah, and I'm sure in an interview you've been asked, tell me about a time you faced a challenge. So double clicking on that, what were is there a story that comes to mind when you were at student agencies? Is there a really tough financial situation, a leadership challenge, or just like a oh crap moment while you're kind of running the student agencies businesses?
Yeah, I don't, I don't know if there's kind of one sort of major crisis or anything that I faced. It was, I think the entire, you know, process, particularly, management of the business and financials is always a bit of a oh crap moment, to be honest. But yeah, I think probably the first and the big one was the first board meeting. So as a CFO, I think you joined in the spring and you kind of get trained up by the, CFO before you. Um, and then, May comes, that former CFO leaves to go do their, investment banking internship in New York City. And then there's a June board meeting, and it's the big one with SAP, SAF, and SAI. And, you're putting together your first deck, you're sending, this wall of numbers to, the chairman of the board. And, I think that's when I, again, had the first kind of, oh crap moments where, the chairman of the board at the time, again, super sharp private equity individual, had been the chairman of the board for a long time, knew the ins and outs of everything. And, I sent him a financial schedule and he asked the question, hey, what's going on here? And I think I kind of tried to hand wave him and say, oh, it's just a timing thing, like whatever, thinking, he's not going to follow up. And he's like, Griffin, like that answer doesn't make any sense. Like that's you. Like, I know I know you're just BSing. Like, it's okay if you don't know, but don't pretend like you know. And, yeah, don't try to pull a fast one on me. And so I think that was a great, moment early was like, oh, all right, this is, we're in the big leagues now. These guys know what's going on. Like, not only are they accomplished, but they've run these businesses before. And so there's not, they're not going to miss anything. So I think that was a big piece for me on the kind of just financial execution of my business. But in terms of leadership challenges, I think the biggest thing that I learned at student agencies was just that, like, accountability is really the biggest differentiator in business, broadly speaking. Like, you learn this at student agencies where if, am I allowed to swear on this? I don't know if that's frowned upon. You like,
An
if
adult show.
like, yeah, it was just, if shit hits the fan, you knew who you could count on and who you couldn't count on. And it became so obvious very fast at student agencies and all of like the best managers. It wasn't necessarily because they were the smartest person or the highest IQ in the room. It was because it was the people that you knew you could rely on if you called on them and if you needed them to get something done. And that's the way it has worked in the real world too, where, IQ gets you so far, but most business investments, et cetera, can kind of be resolved and figured out with, sort of baseline decent IQ, some rational sort of strategic thinking, and then just execution, follow up, like following up on, questions that are asked and, following up on things you said you would do. And it's those sort of things that, like, again, I'm guessing folks learn the hard way in the real world if they don't have that student agencies experience where you learn it very fast at student agencies and you very quickly learn who's good at their job isn't just because they're the smartest person in the room. Who's good at their job is the person who, has work ethic and follows up and is accountable. And, intelligence is helpful for sure, but it's not the end all be all by any means in terms of how to, have success.
Were you involved in hiring at all at Apollo or Barclays or your current firm?
Yeah.
So did you test for, I mean, to me, that's just like get stuff done, kind of mentality. And it never ceases to amaze me how many people, not just students I come across, just don't follow up, don't respond to emails or respond weeks later to emails. Do you
Yeah.
test for that at all? And if so, how do you do it?
Yeah, I think that's always a huge part with our hiring. And so, when we were trying to hire people at Apollo, for instance, you kind of figure that out through a lot of the interview process where it's, hey, when are you available? And like, how responsive are they? And, obviously they have another job usually at that time. So you kind of give some slack there. But then, a lot of what we did, for instance, was remote. And so you said, hey, you have this case study, you have an hour to do it, email them it back to me in an hour. And then, for the folks that you're chasing in an hour and a half, that's sort of a ding. You're like, all right, like, that's not a great sign. I said an hour, I know you can manage your own time. You've got a clock. Like, let's send this back. And so it's a lot of that stuff where you're like, hey, you kind of give them the chance to potentially fail. And then, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's an hour and they said, hey, I got really stuck on this part. This isn't as complete as I would have liked it to be. I'm sorry about that, but and like if I have more time, I can finish it. But you let me know because you said an hour. And to me, I'm like, that's great. Like, I'd rather that than somebody, kind of not respond in the appropriate amount of time. So it's a huge thing for us because you get, again, there are a lot of smart people out there, but it's definitely a very tough thing to suss out too because usually a lot of times people can hide it in interviews and you don't find out until they're, 3 months on the job. And then, that's a bummer for everybody because, particularly in the real world, hiring's expensive. Like, hiring is it's a, it's a process. So,
Yeah.
it's definitely critical, and it's something that you try to suss out as best you can. It's helpful. I mean, reference calls are also huge for that. Um, you can usually tell by kind of talking to a reference of, if they speak really glowingly of somebody, it's again, it's usually not just because of raw intelligence. It's usually because of it's somebody who's a get shit doner.
Right. Exactly. Do we have any other questions for Griffin?
Yeah, I guess I'd love to kind of to wrap everything. My last question would be for you is, it's been a few years. Looking back, what does student agencies mean to you? And you know, are you still connected with the community and the friendships you had there? And what do those people mean to you?
Yeah. I mean, to me, like it was such a foundational piece of my early career. It was like, again, probably my earliest real not real responsibility. Like I had internships before, but they didn't have the sort of responsibility and kind of expectations that you had at student agencies. So to me, it was such a foundational part of my career, and then it was also such a foundational part of my experience at Cornell. So, staying a summer in Cornell was one of the highlights of my college career, and we had a blast. That summer, um, because there's everybody at student agencies, and then you're usually a couple like straggler friends that have random other internships or whatever. And so the crew that stays for the summer in Ithaca is so fun, and you get to see like the beautiful Ithaca. That time of year you get to really become close with everybody. And again, it was fun to learn who you can rely on and you can. And so, you become really close to a lot of the folks at student agencies and some of your other managers. And, it creates fun, fun opportunities, to learn and all that. And then, since then, yeah, definitely been able to stay pretty close with a good amount of folks, who I worked with. I think, as I mentioned, some good mentors who have been helpful just as I, again, have progressed in my career, and folks who I kind of go back to when I have sort of career decisions to make. Obviously, again, I mentioned Michael Carangel. Kyle Carnes has always been great and helpful for me. He was a CEO when I was there. So that alumni network has always been, very helpful and involved. And, the events they do in New York City, I always tried to go to whenever I could, because it's, I don't know, it's a unique group of people that, you kind of form common bond with, particularly, CFO and the president. You end up, as I'm sure is super late nights leading up to the board meetings when you're trying to get everything together. So there's a lot of that kind of, bonding there, and you guys are in the foxhole together, and that sort of thing is always really cool. So, that piece is fun. And then there are like the fun memories too. There's like, like helping out with some of the, big red shipping and storage to, peak move-in months. Sometimes even the particularly fun ones was when we were done working and they need the last minute, they need a hand, and it's like, syllabus week, and you're having fun with your buddies, and you get a call from the manager. It's like, "Hey man, I'm sorry to do this, but I got a truck full of stuff and none of my workers showed up." And you're like, "I guess like I owe you one from the past. So I guess you're cashing in the chip now. I'll be there." And you're like loading somebody's house up with, wearing flip flops and a Hawaiian shirt, and you're, had a couple beers, and you're like, "Oh man, this is ridiculous." But it's, so, that's kind of part of it, right? Like that's part of, I think, everyone's experience is you kind of have some of those moments, and you just, you figure it out, and
That's where the best memories come from, is those moments.
exactly. And again, so much of student agencies is building friendships with the other managers and executive team and such, that you bail each other out in a lot of those situations. Because again, like if you don't feel like you not showing up isn't screwing your buddy over, you might not show up as much. But in student agencies, it was often like, "Hey, if I don't do this and get this done, you know, the president, Maddie or Luke Bushner, kind of towards the end of my head, I was like, that's gonna really stink for them, and they're gonna be personally like, Griff, come on, man. Like I thought, like why'd you throw me under the bus here? So there's a lot of that kind of personal relationship dynamic, which is, yeah, it's important, and it's the sort of thing that you try to also build again in the real world at other jobs. You try to build those cultures, because again, that being able to count on each other is so important, and it's critical. So
Yeah. Well, Griffin, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate hearing your insights. Loved your stories and um, all the little things you talked about. But yeah, until the next episode.
Yeah. Thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thank you guys. Thank you guys for including me in this, and good luck the rest of the year here.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.